just to connect the Constitution in a metaphorical way with the blues and jazz in a way that often Murray and Ellison implied, but he really drew out that dimension.
Yeah.
He spelled it out. Join us for Straight Ahead, the Omni-American podcast.
Welcome to Straight Ahead, the Omni-American podcast. I'm your co-host, Aria Tepper, here with my friend and co-host, Greg Thomas. How you doing today, Greg?
I'm doing great. Looking forward to our conversation today.
Absolutely. We're going to have a conversation about an essay that is political wisdom embodied in music that speaks to a crisis of our moment in time. Blues to be Constitutional, which was an essay published by Stanley Crouch, originally based upon an address that he offered. He began offering these public addresses on the Constitution as a blues document at Harvard in 1992, and then he gave in 95 at Michigan State University, and that became the essay that we have today. And Stanley, in this essay, the crisis that he treats is the rise of an illiberal left and right filled with resentment. He saw this back in the 90s against Western modernity, and he offers an alternative, which is a robust American culture grounded in the tragic optimism of the founding documents and embodied in jazz that leaves room for the emergence of human soulful nobility. But before we get to the essay itself, you were good friends with Stanley. So maybe if you could please introduce him to the audience.
Absolutely. Stanley was born in Los Angeles in 1945. Passed away 4 years ago in 2020. And he grew up as a very voracious reader. By the time he was in high school, he had read many of the classic works of American literature by Fitzgerald and Hemingway and such. He was a part of the civil rights movement, even of the Black arts movement. His first literary recognition came from being a poet. And he taught at the college level. And in the 70s, he left California, came to New York, and became a part of the jazz loft scene. He played drums. He lived with and played drums with David Murray, saxophonist, who is one who combines an allegiance to the jazz tradition on tenor saxophone, as well as the avant-garde tradition. And it was that avant-garde tradition that Stanley was enmeshed in. And through meeting and delving into the work of Ralph Ellison and Albert Murray, he made a transition from that to really being grounded in this blues idiom perspective. And I think this was signaled in the late 70s by a debate that he had with Amiri Baraka in the pages of The Village Voice. And he became an excellent essayist, novelist, biographer, and he was a friend of mine and a dear friend who really supported me as a writer, challenged me as a writer and a thinker. And I think that this essay is one of his signal pieces.
Absolutely. And it's interesting that you point to his trajectory, moving from the avant-garde to, in his terms, a more mature adult vision of life and of art, because I think that's reflected in the trajectory of this essay itself. I mean, what he's talking about, he knows about, I think, from the inside. And the question that Stanley opens the essay, but basically the question that animates the essay from the beginning is, why do Americans love outlaws? And in treating that question, his opening sentence, he writes, "I stand here not as a scholar of the Constitution, but as a student of the human soul." Now, keep that in mind because we're going to come back to that. but he says that America was born in and sustained by a rebellious spirit. Right? Boston Tea Party, Underground Railroad, Billy the Kid.
Even the civil rights movement, where there were certain laws on the books that were, based in segregation. And there was the, going against that.
Right.
And ending up in jail.
Right. So that rebellious spirit, that spirit of possible reform and correction, definitely has a positive side to it. But what Stanley was seeing was that this spirit, this rebellious spirit, was much less a means to an end, that end being a truly free country, but was becoming a path itself in which people were, he writes, straining against the constraints of modern civilization, right? And from this perspective, he pointed to a particularly American kind of frustration, American mode of modern frustration. It's modern because the idea that human evil and suffering is not a product of human life, but is particular to a kind of civilization, is a modern idea.
Mm-hmm.
And it's American because it's in this American mode. Billy the Kid, James Dean, right?
Mm-hmm.
So what's American? You find it in a love of the gangster rap for Stanley, which he didn't like, gangster movies, and in a love of symbolic violence. And here he kind of hit the French nail on the head. He refers to the love of the noble savage.
Tell us about the noble savage.
Right. So in pointing to the noble savage, I think what Stanley is pointing to is this is an old trope that we find beginning that Rousseau really made popular, which is that modern civilization is responsible for our deformities. And it's breaking away from modern civilization that we're going to become whole again to an ancient ideal or a natural ideal. And in this context, the noble savage becomes an alternative. Here you have someone who isn't split, not really for himself or for the modern person. For Rousseau, is you're never completely for yourself. You're never completely for others. You're always split. Here, the noble savage is at least whole, completely for himself, acting from internal motivation, full of vitality. That becomes the alternative. And you know what? I think when you take the love of gangsters and you add that to a love of symbolic violence, you know what you get? You get sentimental, adolescent, post-colonial love of Hamas. The vision, a person fighting against Western civilization, that's how they're projecting onto the world. And they're really whole. They're completely for themselves. They're rejecting, full of vitality. It's symbolic violence. And if you'll note, a lot of these post-colonial and Stanley, you know this. Stanley hated sentimentality.
Well, matter of fact, I'd like to read a quick quote from the essay that aligns with what you're saying. He wrote that in the world of the prematurely cynical, the bad boy reigns, for he represents retreat into pouting anarchy. A little further along, he says, unearned cynicism, much more frequently than not, is no more than a brittle version of sentimentality.
There you go. And I guess what do you think? I think that informed his taste. I'm thinking out loud now, and I'd love to hear your take on it, if you have a take on it. But that view informed his taste, that mature view of life where you progressed beyond sentimentality into a more fully the tragic optimism in the blues. That sentimentality then became something in his evaluation of music and culture. That informed his view. Wherever he found sentimentality, he had no patience and no time for it.
Absolutely. I mean, that's one of the reasons why he's so critical of much of rock and roll and of hip hop, both which play into that kind of bad boy image. And it's grounded in a 1960s valorization of the youth culture. And what Wynton Marsalis says ultimately is an exploitation of the sexuality of youth. And so one of the points that appealed to me about Stanley in the 90s, when I was getting into the work of Ralph Ellison and Albert Murray very deeply, I had been into jazz since the late 70s, but it was the intellectual and philosophical dimensions that Stanley introduced me to, which then led me to Ralph Ellison and Albert Murray, that caused me to really keenly pay attention to him. So I remember seeing him one time on a program, and he said this there, and he says it in this essay, that, jazz is adult music, and when you talk about a tragic optimism, that's a very mature way of seeing the world. And when you're looking at the world through the eyes of what he called unearned cynicism, yes, things are wrong. But if you don't have a tragic sense of life, you end up with these frames of rejection. You're rejecting this, you're rejecting that, and you're not counterposing that with the appreciation of life, the affirmation of life. What are the things that we've gained? How have we grown? Those perspectives too, that go beyond the sentimentality. Now, this is another point he makes.
Right.
Because he relates and connects. This is very important. Because The Blues to be Constitutional is the title of the essay. He's connecting the blues and jazz to the Constitution.
Right. So
the Constitution, a preeminently modern document, one of the things he says is it has a tragic base. Another thing he says is it goes against the sentimentality of the divine right of kings.
Right.
That based on how you were born, your class or caste position, that determines your life course.
If I can copy you just for 1 second, which is that Stanley's saying the problem is not with the system or modern civilization. The problem is that there are elementary and elemental shortcomings of human life. And I think that's something that he considered the framers of the Constitution recognized.
Absolutely. They absolutely did. I mean, he says that one of the things about the blues is that, and I'll put it in my own words, it holds out hope, but it knows that right around the corner, the blues is coming back.
Right.
I mean, B.B. King once, he has a song where he says, hey, nobody loves me but my mama. Nobody loves me but my mama.
Yeah.
And she might be jiving too.
Right. So our father, our king, if we go back to the sentimentality of monarchy, our father, the king, that's nice. Because that's that overly sentimental attachment to monarchy can blind you. So what the Constitution does,
it's a democratic responsibility.
Well, yes, but what you have, if we're going to point to how the Constitution as a founding document takes into consideration these elemental shortcomings of human life. So the separation of powers, where we're separating power, that comes out of the recognition of the possibility of human evil. Sometimes, let's stop calling the king our daddy. So, sometimes power corrupts, and it was incompetent, and the divine right of kings. Let's stop trying to fool ourselves that this person's power comes from God when it's clearly all about himself or herself. So you have the separation of powers
and their family.
Yeah, and then you also have, but where does the Constitution as a founding document also take into consideration our better angels, and that's in the provision for individual liberty
and human dignity.
Right.
There's he quotes from Thomas Mann, The Coming Victory of Democracy,
right,
connecting democracy to human dignity.
right.
And Stanley says in the essay that when you're talking about human dignity, that's ultimately, like a spiritual thing. It's a spiritual inheritance. So when he's dealing with democracy and you're talking about the blues, you're talking about the earthy, secular foundation of so much of American music. But it ascends and attempts to transcend. So it has both the earthy and the transcendent.
Right.
And that's encapsulated in the blues. But he also equates the Constitution to jazz and the improvisational, dimension. But I think another dimension that, to stick with the Constitution, that we have to mention is the role of the amendment process.
Right, the improvisational, innovative.
Yeah, but just the process of the amendment process in the Constitution, he relates that to the ability to redress the wrongs of the past. Corruption is kind of inherent in human societies. Power corrupts. And so the Constitution and the founders, they were clear based on their own history and the history of human beings, particularly in politics throughout history, that if you don't have checks and balances and ways to redress the wrongs of the past, you fall into all types of folly.
Right.
So he equated the music as a tragic foundation, but also jazz as an improvisational way that you can counterstate something that was stated before, some ways for you to respond and be in democratic dialogue. All of that is in this great essay.
Right. And if we can step back to this, if we can go back to a second to the folly or to the mud. Mm-hmm. So for Stanley, he calls the American constitutional system, it calls the American Constitution a blues document. And he means something particular about that, and particularly, in my opinion, deep, which is that the American system leaves room for public deliberation as part of elections in which there is, one hopes, a free press, so that we can get it all out on the table. Now, what's this got to do with the blues? We play the blues to overcome the blues. And Stanley here is receiving from his teacher, Albert Murray. And Murray, in the idea of stomping the blues, talks about how the blues music comes to defeat the blues feeling. And it does this very sophisticated relationship between the lyrics and the instrumental rhythmic aspect of the music. The lyrics, the first thing you have to do if you want to stomp the blues is you have to tell it like it is. There's no bullshitting. You can't cover anything over and you can't hide. You have to, it's the same thing as the frontier scientific explorer. You have to see things as they are, and then you're going to have to figure things out. But you have that open discussion, which means that the American discussion is going to be messy. The American public discourse is going to be messy, right? So how do you then overcome it? Like you were talking about, where he turns to Mann, says democracy has to be at its highest understood as leaving room for the possibility of human greatness in the spiritual sense. We can't do away with aristocracy in a spiritual sense. And here, Stanley, and this is getting back to where we started, right? Remember that first sentence where he says to you, I stand here before you as a student of the human soul? Stanley says that when we're talking about aristocracy, he writes, a jazz musician would probably say the soul. And he puts that in italics, the soul. So I think from there we can really bring home what he sees as everything that's implied, the wisdom implied in this monumental music, and the political wisdom embodied in the music and in this text. But I'm sorry, go ahead.
Absolutely. No, cool. He calls it a down-home aristocracy. So that phrase in and of itself makes it distinct from the aristocracy of the inherited divine right of kings. This is a gut bucket,
Right.
earthy
Yeah.
aristocracy,
Yeah.
a nobility of the soul, as you say. Okay.
Right. And the soul, I think here, the idea of antagonistic cooperation comes into play. It's going to be messy, but we're going to treat everything. We're going to look at all of the different challenges that we're facing as opportunities for the soul to grow and to reassert itself. And you can't be afraid of hardship. You have to understand that pain is part of the process of revelation. But that is the way, revelation about yourself and about your deeper self and about your culture and about your friends and about life. But that's the way that the soul grows and augments itself. That is a very powerful idea which cuts against much of the grain of our time.
Absolutely. And I think that another dimension of the blues and jazz that we haven't mentioned is that its origins in a Negro American or Black American experience.
Yeah.
In the essay, he says that we can't make too much. We have to acknowledge that historical fact. It's very important, historically, culturally. He says, but it's not just about a downtrodden group that was able to create these forms. He said, because if it was just about, and I'm putting this in my own words, going through tough times, you would have seen greater art during the 20th century. He says that. He says that it's about, and I'm going to put in my own words again, it's about the way they were able to create these forms that embodies the reality, the unsentimental blues reality of life.
Right.
With a tragic underpinning and a tragic base, while at the same time aspiring through the discipline of artistic creation, aspiring to excellence and greatness, and doing that accentuates their individuality in a way that Martin Williams, who wrote the jazz tradition, who Stanley quotes, he talks about when you look at the way jazz accentuates individuality, the philosophical implications are almost too great to contemplate.
Right, yeah.
But the thing is, this is an individuality that's not the bad boy fighting against society for his or her own sake. I say bad boy, his or her.
The bad boy or girl of society. We are.
Right. Or creating, chaos.
Right.
This is about creating an individuality that contributes to the whole, to the ensemble, to the society. So it's that individual and group dynamic, that balance that we see in jazz music in particular, which Stanley thinks is the highest and greatest form, ultimately, of American music, and I agree. How it treats the individual and the group. Now, these are all democratic themes that we're talking about.
Right. Sure.
And he connects all of these.
I think it's very important that you also pointed to the grounding in the Black American historical experience, because I think it's very helpful to make it human. And when you make it human, because then what that means is that at certain points in our history, and these parts of American history need to be told, there were individuals in incredibly cruel and oppressive circumstances who made the decision that I'm going to grow through everything that happens to me. Once you make that decision as a human being, that's what we're talking about with antagonistic cooperation. That's the soul asserting itself. To think that that's possible to do is astounding. Once you break through that wall, think about the energy that if now that's your attitude towards human life as a whole, I think then we can say that's Stanley talked about the positive feeling that was communicated in the rhythm of the music. That might be part of the original founding energy of swing. That's when you can break through that wall, then you're ready to swing.
Absolutely. I mean, Murray and Stompin' the Blues call it the velocity of celebration. Celebrating what? Celebrating life itself, in spite of all the things that are not good, or that are the underside, the muddy side, the shadow sides of the human condition. And so that's the power of the arts and the music, because as Andre Malraux said, and he didn't mention Andre Malraux in this essay, but Malraux, that is a favorite of Ellison and Murray in particular. You know, the fact that you have the human monument of art over time is the way that humanity, man, woman, they put what I'm going to call in Murray terms their own stamp on the epidermis of actuality. Yeah. What did that phrase, epidermis of actuality, mean to Murray? Entropy. Entropy, the second law of thermodynamics, the tendency, as Murray described it, of things to become random, chaotic. But art is a standing, living testament of the human fortitude and the human ability to create things that will stand the test of time,
right?
Like the blues, like jazz, etc.
Right. I think we should add for our viewers, hopefully this discussion we're deeply countercultural. We're very rebellious. We think people would benefit. We want people to read. And I think that hopefully this conversation can inspire some people to check out Stanley. One way in which we've really, I think, done an injustice is because, man, the writing is so good. I think might also be part of the reason why he's not taken sufficiently seriously as a thinker, because the writing is so good.
Absolutely. I mean, just listen to this. The success of jazz is a victory for democracy and a symbol of the aesthetic dignity, which is finally spiritual, that performers can achieve and express as they go about inventing music and meeting the challenge of the moment. I mean, he talks about lyricism. You mentioned about the functional lyrics. He is so lyrical in his writing. Yeah. So he became an essayist and a biographer and a novelist, but poetry is at the foundation, and his images, in our friendship, we would talk, and he was a master of metaphor, and that was like one of his nicknames, because he was able to create these connections just to connect the Constitution in a metaphorical way with the blues and jazz in a way that often Murray and Ellison implied, but he really drew out that dimension. Yeah. He spelled it out. So we would urge people to check out this essay. In fact, we will have a link to it in the show notes, and appreciate it, because it's a great example from the blues idiom wisdom tradition.
There you go. All right. So look, I appreciate all your insight and thank you for bringing from your experience, your friendship with Stanley. And I agree with you. And hopefully from this conversation, again, people will be inspired to check out for themselves. Stanley Crouch, Blues to be Constitutional. Thank you very much, everyone, for viewing and listening.
Thank you for watching us on Straight Ahead, the Omni-American podcast.
Subscribe today and fight for a future in which the many join as one against bigotry.